Contact bearing 090. Requesting immediate air support.
Enemy destroyers spotted! Bearing 040!
All hands, sound the alarm! Battle stations!
January 17th, 1943. The waters off the Solomon Islands were cloaked in a thick, gray fog. Dawn had yet to pierce the horizon, and the sea lay unnervingly still, a silent canvas hiding shadows beneath its surface. Through the mist, the silhouettes of Japanese destroyers emerged, sleek, dark, and bristling with armaments. The crews moved with tense precision, aware that the fog was both ally and enemy, concealing them while obscuring what might lie ahead. On the bridge of one destroyer, the captain squinted into the haze, binoculars useless against the dense moisture. Every faint ripple, every muffled clang of metal against metal demanded attention. The radio crackled with cautious reports, each voice tinged with uncertainty. No one knew what waited beyond the veil of gray. Then, without warning, figures appeared, enemy ships cutting through the fog, silent predators of the Pacific night. The Japanese Navy, confident in its routine patrols, froze in disbelief. The destroyers surged forward, engines roaring, cutting through mist like knives. What began as a routine sweep became a moment of shock, chaos, and sudden confrontation that would leave both sides struggling to adapt. The fog was no longer a cover, it was a battlefield. By early 1943, the Pacific War had shifted from rapid Japanese expansion to a grueling contest of attrition. Following the devastating attacks across Southeast Asia and the Pacific in 1941 to 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had established a string of defensive perimeters from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. These lines were intended to protect resource-rich territories and maintain control over strategic sea lanes. The Solomon Islands, a scattering of tropical outposts, had become a focal point of strategic importance. Their location offered a potential staging ground for either side to threaten supply lines and launch naval or aerial operations. The Japanese, aware of the island's significance, fortified key positions and maintained patrols along critical channels and straits. Destroyers, nimble and heavily armed, became the backbone of these patrols, tasked with reconnaissance, escort, and rapid response strikes. At the same time, the Allied forces, led primarily by the United States Navy, had begun probing these perimeters. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942, had exposed weaknesses in Japanese coordination and logistics. Naval battles in narrow waters and under the cover of darkness highlighted the vulnerabilities of large ships, making destroyers and cruisers the ideal instruments for surprise engagements. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive interception and swift, decisive strikes. Commanders relied on visual spotting, radio reports, and prearranged patrol routes to detect enemy movements. But the Allies were beginning to exploit new tactics, including night attacks and coordinated carrier-based air support, which challenged traditional Japanese confidence. Technological limitations, particularly in radar detection, compounded the danger. Japanese crews were trained to trust their eyes, their instincts, and their discipline, but in a fog-choked channel, those tools could fail spectacularly. Intelligence gathering, too, had become a cat-and-mouse game. Both sides intercepted radio traffic, deployed scouts, and relied on reconnaissance flights. The Japanese High Command believed it had accounted for Allied positions, plotting destroyer movements along predictable paths. Yet, the Allies had begun to anticipate these patterns, setting traps that leveraged both environmental conditions and the element of surprise. Within this framework, Japanese destroyers set out on routine patrols, confident in the strength of their formations. Each vessel carried a complement of torpedoes, guns, and depth charges designed to repel intruders or strike first. Crews drilled relentlessly, familiar with each maneuver, each emergency protocol. Still, no preparation could fully account for the unpredictable combination of fog, darkness, and human error. By January 1943, both sides were locked in a quiet, deadly tension. Every ship movement mattered. Every misstep could invite disaster. For the Japanese Navy, the fog of the Solomon waters was both shield and threat, a test of skill, nerve, and command. Unseen forces waited beyond each bend of the channel, ready to exploit the slightest hesitation. It was into this precarious environment that the destroyers would sail, unaware that the day's patrol would become a pivotal moment in naval warfare, where instinct and training collided with chaos and surprise. As January 17th, 1943 approached, the Solomon Islands remained a theater of constant vigilance. Japanese destroyers routinely patrolled the narrow channels between islands, where the sea could conceal both opportunity and danger. The fog, common in these waters during the early hours of morning, created a shifting veil that could either shield a fleet or betray its presence. For the Japanese Navy, understanding the interplay of weather and terrain was as critical as knowing the enemy's position. On the Allied side, intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were reinforcing their positions near Guadalcanal and nearby islets. American reconnaissance aircraft, flying above the mist, relayed sporadic sightings of Japanese convoys and destroyer movements. This information, though incomplete, allowed Allied commanders to predict probable patrol routes. They understood that Japanese destroyers often relied on familiar patterns, making them vulnerable to carefully orchestrated interceptions. In response, the Japanese Admiralty had issued precise orders. Destroyers were to conduct sweeps along key channels, maintain radio silence to avoid detection, and report any anomalies via encrypted transmissions. Captains were instructed to exercise caution, but to strike decisively if enemy vessels were encountered. Every ship was on high alert, yet confidence in their training and coordination remained strong. The crews, seasoned by months of wartime patrols, had become attuned to the dangers of these waters. The fog, while limiting visibility, also gave a sense of control until it did not. The night before the engagement, officers reviewed maps detailing currents, shoals, and potential enemy positions. Destroyer formations were plotted to maximize coverage, their speed carefully calculated to reduce the risk of collision while ensuring readiness for combat. On board, sailors prepared torpedoes, verified armaments, and checked engines. Every routine inspection, every precaution reinforced the belief that the patrol would proceed as planned. Yet the fog added a variable that no calculation could fully anticipate. Visibility was reduced to mere hundreds of meters, and the muffled sounds of engines, waves, and signaling flags created an eerie auditory landscape. The Japanese relied heavily on sight, a traditional approach that had served them well in clear waters. In these conditions, even the most experienced eyes could be deceived. Shadows shifted with the movement of the mist, and the faint outline of an approaching vessel could vanish and reappear in an instant. As dawn neared, radio operators intercepted fragmented Allied communications, an unsettling confirmation that enemy ships were nearby. The commanders interpreted the signals cautiously, unsure whether they indicated routine patrols or a prepared ambush. Across the fleet, tension mounted. Crews gripped railings, scanning the fog, listening for the slightest anomaly, their training at war with the uncertainty of nature itself. By the early hours, the destroyers were fully underway, engines humming through the gray sea. The mist twisted around the hulls, making distances deceptive and reducing reaction time. The Japanese Navy, confident in their dominance, pressed forward, unaware that Allied forces had calculated an interception point, exploiting both the terrain and the thick fog. This moment of convergence, where preparation met unpredictability, set the stage for a confrontation that would shock the Japanese Navy, testing the limits of discipline, coordination, and sheer nerve. On the decks of the Japanese destroyers, the fog was more than a visual obstruction. It was a psychological one. Sailors, trained for months in disciplined routines, now found themselves immersed in an environment that tested their senses and resolve. The mist muted sounds, distorted distances, and obscured threats, creating an unnerving sense of isolation. Each sailor relied on instinct as much as training, eyes scanning the gray expanse, ears tuned to every metallic clatter or distant ripple. Junior officers, tasked with monitoring torpedo readiness and gun crews, felt the weight of anticipation pressing down with each passing minute. In silence, they moved from station to station, checking instruments, confirming signals, and exchanging brief nods, a language of tension and precision. Even seasoned veterans, accustomed to the unpredictability of war, found the dense fog disorienting. Conversations were minimal. The atmosphere was heavy with a shared understanding that the next sighting could determine life or death. The fear was quiet, almost invisible. There were no dramatic exclamations, only the tight grip on railings, the subtle twitch of an eye, the shallow intake of breath. Adrenaline sharpened reflexes, but it also magnified every uncertainty. The human element, often overshadowed by tactics or technology, became central. Men depended not just on orders, but on each other, trusting that discipline would hold firm when chaos arrived. The Japanese Navy's tactical doctrine emphasized swift, coordinated strikes, especially in constrained waters. Destroyers were designed for agility, able to outmaneuver larger ships while delivering torpedo barges. However, in the fog-choked channels of the Solomons, tactics required adaptation. Visual identification, the cornerstone of Japanese naval coordination, was severely compromised. Commanders had to rely on intermittent radio updates, prearranged formations, and intuitive judgment. Formation discipline became both a shield and a constraint. Ships maintained staggered distances to reduce the risk of collision. Yet these gaps also allowed enemy vessels to infiltrate unnoticed. Maneuvering required precise calculations of speed, bearing, and distance, all while accounting for currents, wind, and the unpredictable movements of the mist. One misstep could result in ships crossing paths, torpedoes firing too close, or exposure to enemy fire. The tactical challenge was compounded by the presence of Allied forces actively seeking engagement. Allied planners understood Japanese patrol patterns and leveraged environmental conditions to create opportunities for surprise attacks. The Japanese, operating under assumptions of predictable enemy behavior, were suddenly confronted with maneuvers that defied expectation. The fog, intended as cover, became a battlefield of obscured lines and fleeting opportunities. Commanders were forced to balance aggression with caution, initiating offensive moves while anticipating ambushes. Communication protocols, honed for daylight operations, were tested to their limits. Flag signals, lights, and intermittent radio bursts had to convey critical instructions without betraying position. In the fog, split-second decisions determined whether a destroyer could evade a torpedo, reposition for attack, or avoid collision. Tactics were alive, reactive, and fragile, reliant on both the discipline of crews and the sharpness of commanders' instincts. These human and tactical angles converged in a moment where every decision, every reflex, and every calculation mattered. Sailors relied on training and trust, commanders on intuition and doctrine, and both were challenged by the relentless unpredictability of the environment. The stage was set. When the first enemy ships emerged from the mist, the human heart and tactical acumen would be tested in equal measure. Technology in the foggy waters of the Solomon Islands was both an advantage and a limitation. Japanese destroyers were equipped with powerful torpedoes, the Long Lance, oxygen-fueled and capable of devastating hits at long range. Their guns could rain fire on approaching ships, but both weapons systems relied on accurate spotting and timing. In dense fog, sight lines collapsed. Torpedo launches became a gamble, the trajectory uncertain, the target often only a shadow. Radar and sonar technologies were beginning to influence naval engagements, but the Japanese Navy lagged behind the Allies in early 1943. While the Americans experimented with radar-guided targeting, many Japanese vessels depended primarily on human observation. Lookouts strained against the mist, while sonar operators listened for faint hums and vibrations in the water. Each ping, each muffled sound, demanded interpretation. Was it a friendly ship, a neutral vessel, or an approaching threat? Errors could be fatal, and the fog amplified the uncertainty. Depth charges, a defensive staple against submarines, added another layer of technological complexity. Crews trained endlessly in deployment patterns and timing, but the fog hindered accurate placement and visual confirmation. Technology offered potential superiority, yet environmental conditions stripped away its certainty, leaving sailors and commanders reliant on judgment, intuition, and rapid adaptation. Command decisions under these conditions defined the engagement. Japanese captains faced an impossible calculus: maintain formation, advance aggressively, or retreat to safer waters. Each choice carried profound consequences, amplified by the fog's concealment. A single misjudgment could expose ships to torpedo strikes, collisions, or encirclement. Leadership extended beyond command decisions to the orchestration of crew morale. Orders were terse, precise, and sometimes repeated multiple times to ensure clarity amidst confusion. Captains had to inspire confidence without underestimating risk, balancing authority with the recognition that human limits would be tested. Officers monitored not only the environment, but the psychological state of their crews. Fear could lead to hesitation. Hesitation could be fatal. On the Allied side, leadership emphasized initiative and deception. Commanders anticipated Japanese patterns and used the fog to mask movements. Decisions were often made with incomplete information, relying on reconnaissance reports, intercepted communications, and calculated risk. Coordinating attacks under such conditions demanded both decisiveness and flexibility. Leaders had to trust that crews would execute complex maneuvers with precision, even in near-total uncertainty. The convergence of technological capability and leadership shaped the battle before it truly began. Torpedoes ready, engines humming, eyes scanning the mist, and minds calculating possibilities. Every factor was a test of skill and nerve. The Japanese Navy, confident in training but constrained by technological limitations and environmental uncertainty, approached the moment that would define the engagement: the sudden appearance of enemy ships emerging through the fog. The fog hung heavy over the channel, a shifting gray shroud that distorted shapes and sound. Suddenly, faint silhouettes appeared. Enemy destroyers cutting silently through the mist, their outlines barely discernible until they were almost upon the Japanese formation. On board, crews froze for a heartbeat, the familiar rhythm of patrols replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The Japanese Navy, trained for aggression and confidence, had not anticipated this direct encounter under such conditions. On the bridge of the lead destroyer, the captain's voice was sharp and precise. Orders were issued to alter course. Engines surged and gun crews braced. Torpedo officers prepared for immediate launches, calculating angles with split-second urgency. The first torpedo spread was fired almost instinctively, a mixture of training and necessity. Through the fog, white streaks arced across the gray water, each a potential strike against the unseen enemy. The enemy, however, was equally prepared. Allied destroyers had exploited the Japanese reliance on predictable patrol patterns. Their approach was silent, calculated, and designed to maximize confusion. When torpedoes arced through the mist, some missed, some detonated against hulls, sending sprays of water and clouds of smoke into the air. Explosions echoed strangely, muffled by the fog, creating a surreal auditory landscape where every sound seemed magnified and delayed. Japanese gunners scrambled, adjusting fire on fleeting targets, relying on flashes, the ripple of water, and instinct. The fog rendered visual coordination nearly impossible. Ships maneuvered with extreme caution, engines straining, as they attempted to avoid collisions while staying within striking distance. Every turn, every acceleration was a gamble. Below decks, sailors clung to ladders and rails, gripping tightly as the destroyer pitched from one evasive maneuver to another. Torpedo explosions rocked the hull, rattling compartments and sending shrapnel through the air. Fear and focus intertwined. Training became instinct, and instinct became survival. The human element was at its peak, each crew member's decisions, reactions, and courage directly affecting the outcome of the unfolding chaos. Amid the confusion, leadership proved decisive. Japanese captains attempted to regain formation, issuing commands over crackling radios, while adjusting for the fog and enemy unpredictability. The coordination of maneuvers was fragile. Even minor errors threatened to break the line, exposing ships to concentrated fire. On the Allied side, commanders anticipated these adjustments, exploiting the disarray with tactical precision. As the first waves of fire and torpedoes struck, it became clear that the engagement would not be a simple patrol confrontation. The Japanese Navy, confident in doctrine and training, was confronted with an evolving battlefield where visibility, speed, and timing dictated outcomes more than raw firepower. Moments that had been calculated on maps and in briefings gave way to instantaneous decision-making under extreme stress. For 30 minutes, the channel became a vortex of movement and sound. Destroyers weaved through fog-shrouded waters, firing, dodging, and recalculating in real time. Explosions flared, water surged, and smoke mingled with mist, creating a surreal scene where perception was unreliable. Yet, amidst the chaos, Japanese crews maintained remarkable discipline, executing maneuvers that relied on muscle memory, trust, and rapid interpretation of scant signals. The initial engagement ended with both sides reevaluating positions, some ships damaged, others narrowly evading destruction. The Japanese Navy, initially shocked by the sudden confrontation, began to adapt, recalibrating tactics in the fog and preparing for a counterstrike. The battle was far from over. The turning point was still unfolding, as each commander now understood that the next moments could decide the fate of the fleet in these perilous waters. The fog had thickened to a near-impenetrable wall. Shapes of destroyers flickered in and out of view, their movements a combination of deliberate tactics and instinctive reactions. Japanese captains, now fully aware of the enemy's presence and intentions, began coordinating more aggressive maneuvers. Orders were shouted, relayed, and acknowledged through tense nods and hand signals. The crews responded with precision, executing turns and speed adjustments that were almost second nature. Allied destroyers pressed the attack, using the fog to mask their positioning. Torpedo spreads continued, some finding their marks, tearing into hulls, sending sailors scrambling and fires breaking out on deck. Each hit sent a shock through the Japanese formation. Alarms blared, guns reeled back into action, and damage control teams rushed to contain flooding and suppress flames. Panic was restrained by discipline. Amid explosions and shrieking metal, the Japanese sailors' training became the critical factor between survival and catastrophe. The battle evolved into a deadly chess match. Japanese destroyers attempted flanking maneuvers, weaving through the fog to gain advantageous angles for torpedo launches. Allied ships anticipated these moves, countering with evasive patterns and precise gunfire. Each vessel's position constantly shifted, creating a dynamic battlefield where seconds could mean the difference between life and destruction. The interplay of strategy, skill, and sheer nerve was on full display, as captains on both sides exploited every advantage the fog allowed. Technological factors, previously subdued by the weather, began to assert influence. Lookouts strained to detect the faintest shadows, while sonar operators interpreted irregular pulses in the water. Torpedoes that had once seemed certain missed by mere meters. Others found their targets, breaching armor and igniting fires. Depth charges were deployed against suspected submarine threats, detonating with concussive force that rattled the decks. In this chaotic environment, technology and human judgment were inseparable, each amplifying the other's importance. Leadership again proved decisive. Japanese commanders, initially surprised, adjusted strategies mid-engagement, signaling coordinated attacks and retreat maneuvers with remarkable composure. Officers on deck issued orders to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure. On the Allied side, flexibility and anticipation paid dividends. Commanders had calculated likely Japanese responses and used the fog to conceal their own formations. Decisions made in these tense moments directly shaped the outcome, with split-second judgment determining whether a ship would survive, retreat, or be lost. After nearly an hour of intense maneuvers, the Japanese destroyers, battered but still operational, began consolidating positions. Some had sustained moderate damage. Fires had been controlled, torpedo launches recalculated, and gunnery refocused. The Allied ships, having achieved strategic disruption, pulled back slightly to regroup and reassess. The confrontation, while not yet decisive in destruction, had shifted the psychological and tactical balance. The Japanese Navy, once confident in routine patrols and the fog as an ally, now recognized that the environment could turn deadly and that surprise could strike at any moment. By mid-morning, the engagement drew toward a tenuous pause. Both sides assessed damage, recalculated positions, and prepared for potential continuation. The first shock of the encounter had passed, but its implications resonated throughout the fleet. Training and doctrine had been tested against improvisation, technology, and the unpredictable hand of nature. The Japanese Navy, once startled by the sudden appearance of enemy destroyers through the mist, began to regain composure, but the experience had left an indelible mark on commanders and crews alike. The fog had revealed vulnerabilities in planning, highlighted the limits of visibility-dependent tactics, and emphasized the lethal potential of surprise in naval warfare. The moment of confrontation had passed, but its consequences, the human, technological, and strategic lessons, would ripple through the remainder of the campaign, setting the stage for the aftermath. The first light of day revealed the toll of the fog-shrouded engagement. Japanese destroyers, once sleek and commanding in the gray waters, now bore the scars of sudden confrontation. Hulls were dented, superstructure scorched, and gun emplacements damaged by enemy fire. Crew members, exhausted from hours of high-stress maneuvering, moved through decks littered with splintered wood, twisted metal, and the remnants of torpedo detonations. The fog had lifted slightly, but its memory lingered in the form of treacherous visibility and the disorientation it had caused. Casualties were immediate and sobering. Sailors injured by shrapnel or concussive force were tended to by medics working under extreme conditions. Several men were killed outright in the first waves of torpedo strikes, their absence noted with grim efficiency. Despite the chaos, the discipline of the Japanese Navy prevailed. Crews carried out damage control drills, fighting fires, sealing breach compartments, and maintaining readiness for further attacks. The efficiency of these efforts prevented more catastrophic losses, yet the psychological impact was unmistakable. Morale, once buoyed by confidence in training and doctrine, had taken a hit. The shock of encountering well-prepared enemy destroyers in a moment that had seemed routine left officers and sailors reassessing assumptions. The fog, once considered an ally for concealment, had turned against them, exposing vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. Reports filtered back to higher command describing confusion, rapid decision-making under duress, and the near loss of several vessels. These accounts were factual, clinical, and tinged with the gravity of a fleet realizing that even familiar waters could harbor lethal threats. Commanders quickly convened assessments. Damage reports, torpedo expenditure, and readiness for continued operations were compiled. The immediate priority was survival and stabilization, ensuring that the remaining ships could withdraw safely if necessary, and that crews were physically and mentally prepared to continue patrolling or engage again. Japanese High Command, though initially incredulous at the suddenness of the encounter, acknowledged the bravery and rapid response of the crews. Yet there was an unmistakable recognition. The encounter had shaken assumptions about control in the Solomon waters. The engagement also highlighted operational lessons. The importance of maintaining vigilance, even during routine patrols, became a central takeaway. The fog, long considered a natural ally for concealment and maneuver, now demanded constant attention, coordinated tactics, and adaptive leadership. Crew coordination, communication, and rapid decision-making under extreme uncertainty had proven decisive in survival. These lessons would be recorded, studied, and implemented in subsequent operations, influencing training and engagement strategies across the fleet. In the immediate aftermath, the Japanese Navy faced a mixture of relief, frustration, and determination. Relief that catastrophic losses had been avoided, frustration at having been surprised, and determination to adapt and improve. The psychological shock of the engagement lingered, affecting decision-making and preparedness in the following days. The first clash through the fog had ended, but its echoes would shape the conduct of Japanese destroyers and the broader strategy of the naval campaign in the Solomon Islands. The engagement in the fog of the Solomon Islands had immediate operational consequences, but its strategic ramifications extended far beyond the channel where destroyers had clashed. Japanese Naval Command recognized that reliance on predictable patrol routes, visual spotting, and doctrine-centered tactics was increasingly vulnerable. The Allies had demonstrated that surprise, environmental mastery, and adaptive maneuvering could offset Japan's numerical and technical advantages in the region. In the days following the engagement, reports circulated detailing damage to Japanese vessels. Hull breaches on at least 2 destroyers, significant equipment malfunction on multiple ships, and the loss of a number of smaller support craft. Casualty reports were precise. Approximately 35 sailors killed, scores more wounded, and morale shaken across crews assigned to similar patrols. While these losses were not crippling, they marked a psychological turning point. The perception of invulnerability in familiar waters had been irrevocably altered. Strategically, the Allies gained a subtle but significant advantage. Their ability to anticipate Japanese patrols, exploit environmental conditions like fog, and execute precise attacks reinforced the efficacy of their intelligence networks. This success encouraged further use of night operations, coordinated ambushes, and deceptive maneuvers, gradually undermining Japanese control over key maritime routes. The fog engagement became a case study in how smaller, agile forces could impose tactical disruption on a traditionally dominant naval power. For Japanese planners, the lesson was clear: adaptation was no longer optional. Patrol patterns required unpredictability, communication protocols needed refinement, and reliance on visual detection alone was insufficient. Subsequent operations incorporated more rigorous reconnaissance, enhanced coordination between vessels, and the selective use of radar and sonar were available. The engagement highlighted the limitations of traditional doctrine in a modern, technology-driven, and psychologically complex theater of war. Moreover, the incident resonated at the human level within the fleet. Officers recognized that the fog had tested not only tactical competence, but the psychological resilience of crews. Training regimens were updated to include scenarios of reduced visibility, surprise encounters, and rapid response coordination under extreme stress. The battle became a reference point in post-action debriefs, illustrating the interplay between environment, technology, and human decision-making. Allied reports confirmed the effectiveness of their operations. The Japanese destroyers, although not destroyed, had been forced to withdraw or reposition under duress, temporarily ceding control of critical passages. Commanders emphasized that disruption, rather than annihilation, could achieve strategic leverage, a principle that would guide subsequent operations across the Solomon Archipelago. The engagement's significance extended beyond immediate tactical gains. It underscored the evolving nature of naval warfare in the Pacific. Environmental conditions, technological limitations, intelligence gathering, and human psychology had become as decisive as firepower. The Japanese Navy, for the first time in this sector, faced a reality in which assumptions of dominance could no longer guarantee safety, forcing a reevaluation of strategy and reinforcing the Allies' growing momentum. The aftermath of the battle left the Japanese Navy with tangible and intangible consequences: damaged ships, recalibrated tactics, shaken confidence, and hard-earned lessons. The fog that had once cloaked routine patrols now symbolized the unpredictable, lethal complexity of modern naval warfare, a complexity that commanders on both sides would continue to navigate as the Pacific conflict intensified. The fog that had swallowed Japanese destroyers that January morning became more than a meteorological phenomenon. It was a crucible of naval warfare. Within its gray veil, training, technology, and human instinct were tested to their limits. The engagement revealed that even the most disciplined fleets, confident in doctrine and preparation, could be challenged by the unpredictable interplay of nature, enemy ingenuity, and split-second decisions. For the sailors, the encounter left an indelible mark. Fear and adrenaline intertwined with discipline, creating moments of instinctive heroism and careful calculation. Every order, every maneuver, every torpedo fired carried the weight of survival and the stakes of war. Leadership mattered not only in strategy, but in sustaining morale, coordinating action, and instilling calm amid chaos. The human element, resilience, courage, and adaptability, proved as decisive as the weapons in their hands. Technologically, the battle underscored both limitations and potential. Torpedoes, Guns and rudimentary sonar and radar systems offered advantage, but their effectiveness was constrained by visibility, terrain, and human interpretation. The encounter became a living lesson in the integration of man and machine, showing that mastery required both technical skill and psychological fortitude. Strategically, the engagement echoed beyond the foggy channel. It forced the Japanese Navy to reconsider assumptions of control, patrol predictability, and reliance on visual tactics. For the Allies, it reinforced the value of intelligence, adaptability, and audacity. The engagement became a microcosm of the broader Pacific War, a struggle in which knowledge, preparation, and courage intersected with uncertainty, shaping the course of the conflict in ways both immediate and lasting. In the end, the fog did not merely conceal the battle. It illuminated the nature of modern naval warfare. It revealed the fragility of certainty, the power of surprise, and the enduring importance of human courage. The lessons learned, hard-earned in mist and chaos, would resonate long after the ships had moved beyond the channel, shaping strategy, training, and the human understanding of combat in the Pacific. The waters of the Solomon Islands remained unpredictable, but within that uncertainty, the story of January 17th, 1943 endured, a testament to skill, resilience, and the quiet, relentless pressures that define history.